Hello and welcome to our Seed Starting 101 workshop, where we'll go over some of the basics of starting your own seeds. So why would you want to start your own seeds as opposed to going to the greenhouse or the nursery and just getting the seedlings from the stores? Well, starting your own seeds can really help to reduce your carbon footprint in the same way that growing your own food helps to reduce your carbon footprint. Instead of relying on large greenhouses that may transport the seedlings over longer distances, you can actually just get the seeds and start them right at home so you know that you're cutting out that middle transportation step. Another reason is that you can control a lot more of the practices when you're starting your seeds at home. You're able to choose the type of container that you start your seeds in. Oftentimes, seedlings come in really flimsy plastic. And as much as I've tried to not break those plastic pots when I'm taking the seedlings out so that I can reuse them, I do end up breaking at least a few every year, and they end up going into the garbage, and I feel really sad about that. So starting my own seeds at home has helped me to reduce the amount of plastic that gets thrown in the garbage and eventually goes to the landfill. You're also able to make sure that you're keeping your plants healthy. Sometimes the stuff that comes from stores might have some diseases or pest problems, and it's not something that you'll discover until you bring the seedling home. So starting your own seeds at home really helps to give you some control over the health of your plants and what you're actually putting out into your garden eventually. And my favorite part about starting my own seeds is you get to choose the variety that you want to grow or the type of plant you want to grow. So the stuff that you get in stores is kind of standard, kind of boring. It's the same stuff that you'll see year after year. So you've got tomatoes, you've got your peppers. If you're lucky, you might find the right herbs. But if you take a look at a seed catalog, there are so many varieties out there, and it's so much fun to actually flip through and look at the different varieties out there that some have been preserved and the seeds have been saved for generations. Some have been bred for taste, for beautiful colors. There are amazing histories and stories behind so many different varieties. So really, starting your own seeds has a lot to do with food sovereignty. So you're able to decide what types of food you want to grow, whether they're culturally appropriate or things that you're familiar with, or whether you want to try something new. It just gives you that control over the food that you want to grow. So let's get into some of the details of seed starting. A common question is, when do I start my seeds? So that really depends on what type of plant that you're growing, whether that's tomatoes or okra or callaloo, winter melon. Different types of plants have different hardiness levels. So that means how well they'll survive outside when there's a frost at night. So the important information here is the frost-free date. So a frost-free date is an average date. It takes into account a set of data over many, many years, and it creates an average for a certain region. And that average tells you that on this day, there's a 50% chance that you won't have frost. And so that gives you an idea of when you can plant outside. Just keep in mind, though, that if there's a 50% chance that you won't have a frost, there's a 50% chance that you will have a frost. So it's not the date where it's absolutely guaranteed to be safe to plant your seedlings in the ground outside. It's just an average, and it's just essentially a prediction. You'll still have to pay attention to the actual weather and to the actual temperatures on that day. Now, the frost-free date is based on geographic location. So you'll see here on this map, Ontario is split into 9 different zones. Depending on where you are, the zones will help tell you when your frost-free date is. Certainly, one thing to keep in mind is that microclimates do matter. So what I mean by microclimates is I've known some apple farmers who have had apple trees planted along a slope. And on a certain night, when a frost did hit, the trees at the bottom of the slope all suffered frost damage. But the trees at the top of the slope were actually okay. And so that's the type of microclimate I'm talking about. You have to pay attention to topography. You have to pay attention to if you're close to a large body of water. All of those things do matter. So for York Region, we're in Zone C and Zone D, depending on whether you're in Aurora in south or Newmarket in north. And depending on which data you look at, the first frost-free date can vary. So for example, this table here is, I believe, from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Rural Affairs, OMAFRA. And the set of data that they took this from was 1976 to 2005. So they created the average out of that set of data. And so if you take a look at Zone C, the average date of last spring frost is May 3rd. And if you take a look at Zone D, it's May 11th. So it varies on which zone you're in. And so why does that matter in relation to what we want to plant? Like I said, different types of plants will survive better with frost. Some are super sensitive, some are very hardy and pretty tough. And here's a helpful tool. It's a seed planting schedule calculator. And this is actually from Johnny Seeds. So how the calculator works is you figure out which zone you're in and then figure out your frost-free date. You put the frost-free date in here, click enter, and the calculator will actually generate all of these numbers, all of the information in these columns for you. And there's a set list of crops on here, so it's not completely comprehensive, but it is a lot of the popular crops. And here in this column, it'll tell you when is a safe time to set your plants out relative to that frost-free date. So for example, cabbage you can see is pretty frost hardy. So you can take your seedlings and plant them outside 4 weeks before the frost is predicted to end, and it will probably survive. And you compare that to basil, which is pretty sensitive. So you're really going to want to be planting it at least 1 week after the frost-free date. And that way you're really guaranteeing that it will survive. There are lots of recommendations out there to take your frost-free date and then assume that it's going to be a week later. But what does this have to do with starting your seeds? So based on when it's safe to take your seedlings and plant them outside in the ground, you're going to want to start your seeds relative to that. Different plants and different varieties have different numbers of weeks that you should be seeding prior to putting it outside in the ground. So you're going to be doing that calculation of when is your frost-free date, when is it safe to plant outside relative to that date, and then calculate backwards when you want to start your seeds so that it's not sitting in a pot indoors for too long. So some factors to consider for you. What container are you going to start your seeds in? So the ones here are the ones that you typically see and buy from the stores. So they're flimsy plastic, but they will do the job. But there are also lots of fun and innovative options that you can use at home. So for example, you've got clamshell containers where your cherry tomatoes might have come from, and they've got usually these slits at the bottom that let water out. So those are great options. Another thing that we've done before is use these newspaper pots. So they're cheap, they're environmentally friendly. You essentially roll them up and create little pots out of them. Some people will say that you can just throw those directly into the ground when the seedling is ready. I don't love doing that just because the newspaper does need to break down, and if the newspaper is not breaking down quickly enough, the roots will get inhibited and affect the growth of the plant. So usually what I do is just tear off the newspaper, throw the newspaper in the compost, and then plant the seedling in the ground. Some other options, toilet paper rolls or cardboard. We have egg cartons here, little paper cups. These are all things that you can find at home and will really help to reduce the amount of plastic waste that comes out of your gardening activities. This one here is a soil blocker. So it's a little contraption that you can use to create blocks of soil, essentially, that you'll plant directly into. And this way, you're not using plastic at all. You're not even using a container. And so it is very environmentally friendly. It is meant to be healthier for the seedlings because they don't get root bound. And they reduce transplant shock. So the plants are a lot healthier and just raring to go as soon as you plant them outside, as opposed to when the roots get trapped within a container. Certainly there are some downsides to it as well. It's difficult to monitor the moisture level, and so it might dry out quicker, and then you end up overwatering them and you get a layer of algae or mold on top. So it just is a little bit finicky, but it is the benefits are fantastic as well. So what medium are you going to plant into? I know oftentimes when you go to the greenhouse or the nursery or even the stores, it's pretty overwhelming to take a look at all the bags stacked in piles. And this one's a seed starting mix. This one's a potting soil mix. This one is compost. This one's manure. What do you use when you're wanting to actually start your seeds? So the seed starting mix is definitely one that's made specifically for you to start your seeds into. It's generally soilless, so there's no soil in it, no field soil, no compost, and so it's sterile. Seed starting mixes are generally pretty low in nutrients, and that's because seeds don't need nutrients to germinate. The seedlings and the plants will eventually need nutrients in order to feed itself. Seed starting mixes also generally have very fine particles so that there's a lot of contact between the seed itself and the mix. So usually this is made from milled peat moss, perlite, coconut coir, vermiculite, and it is the safest option because it's specifically made for successful germination. Now there is also potting soil, and that can be used for seed starting. It is higher in nutrients, and so it's pretty convenient if you're not planning on planting your tiny seedlings into larger pots for them to grow into larger seedlings. With the nutrients already there, you don't necessarily have to worry about changing that medium. There are coarser particles in potting soil, and it usually does contain some soil or composted manure. So there is a slightly higher chance of some fungus or mold issues. But again, it works fine for seed starting. If that's all you can get your hands on, that's okay. You can use it as well. Now, garden soil, that's something I wouldn't recommend. So going out into the field, just grabbing a bunch of soil, bringing it in, and then trying to start your seeds in there, not the greatest idea, just because the soil out there does contain weed seeds and diseases and some pests and insects that might be detrimental to your seedlings. And so you just have a higher risk of failure when you're doing that. Certainly you can try that, but just the reason we use seed starting mix and even sometimes potting soil is because the ingredients and the portions have been calculated in a way that really sets your seeds up for success. In terms of watering, certainly before seeding, Mix up your planting medium a little bit with some water so that it's dark and fluffy. If you're planting into super dry medium, it's always a lot more difficult to get that germination happening because germination requires water. Now, once you've put the seeds in, make sure you keep the soil lightly moist while the seeds are still germinating. So every single day, check back on it. You can use a misting or spray bottle, that works well, but just make sure that there's good drainage so that the seeds and roots aren't actually rotting and sitting in water. In terms of depth and spacing, always read the back of the seed packet for the details. Depth is always very important when you're starting your seeds inside. Now, row spacing or plant spacing, not quite as important to follow this just yet until you're planting your seedling outside. Certainly, you don't want to be crowding each cell that you're planting the seed in. Usually, the rule of thumb is put in more than one seed so that if one seed fails to germinate, you have one or two others that might come up. If it's a type of seed that's difficult to germinate, put a few more seeds in each cell. The idea is to get one successful seedling per cell. In terms of lighting, seedlings do need quite a lot of light for optimal growth. And you often hear about the south-facing windows having the most light, and it's true. So certainly if you're growing this at home, place them by a south-facing window. Certainly in the spring, the duration of sunlight is not always enough for optimal growth. And I'm going to emphasize optimal growth. So they might do okay, but for optimal growth, you might have to add a little bit of supplemental light. So that might be grow lights. And you can hang the lights about 2 to 4 inches above the top of the seedlings. And seedlings will always lean toward the direction of sun. So if you can have light that's as much on top of the seedlings as possible rather than to the side, that will really help for the seedlings to just grow tall and strong. If the seedlings aren't getting enough light, they will tend to get pretty leggy or etiolated. So you'll see that between each of those sets of leaves, the stem is pretty long and they're kind of leaning and reaching for the light. So you don't really want that. Now, this is germination aids. So sometimes very specific seeds will need a little bit of help from us in order for it to germinate. And so what we're doing is mirroring something that would happen to that seed naturally if it were outside. So one method is scarification or nicking. And essentially, if you've got certain seeds that have really large and thick shells, you can take sandpaper and just rough up the shell a little bit just to help it start to open up. There are certain seeds that you might actually nick a little bit with a knife, sort of like a light scratch, but always do your research first. Not all seeds and most seeds that we tend to grow in the garden for food don't need this. I think the common ones for scarification are some of the flowers out there like morning glory, nasturtiums, that kind of thing. It just helps it to germinate more easily. It's not always necessary. So just do your research on that. Another germination aid might be stratification. So essentially what you're doing is you're simulating a winter period. And some of the seeds just really need that. They need to experience a winter in order to actually germinate. And again, not all seeds need this. And usually most of the ones we're growing in our gardens don't need this. But some of the more perennial flowers, trees and shrubs. So one common one that would need stratification are apple seeds. Essentially what you do is wrap it up in a moist environment and place it in the fridge for however many months, and then you take it out, plant it, and it thinks that it's actually been through a winter. And so it actually starts to germinate. So again, do your research. This is all just sort of interesting information, but probably not something that we would be doing for the regular garden vegetables that we want to plant. There are certain seeds that it just helps to be soaked. So it might not necessarily need it, but if it does get soaked, it has a higher chance of germinating. So just do a quick Google search, see which ones can be helped by soaking. So the different types of seeds, let's go over that. There's a lot of confusion around some of these things. So let's actually understand what it is we're dealing with. So heirloom versus hybrid seeds, what's the difference? It gets pretty overwhelming and confusing when you're looking at all the different seed packets. So heirloom or heritage seeds, the parents are of the same variety. For hybrid, the parents are different varieties. Okay, so for heirloom or heritage, it's a variety that's been maintained for many, many, many years. So a set period of time, which is usually a minimum of 50 years. And so it's been kept for very specific character traits, whether that's a particular taste or a particular color, or perhaps it's resistant to a certain type of disease. There's a reason that heirlooms or heritage seeds have been kept in circulation over and over again. One thing to note is if you're getting heirloom or heritage seeds, when you save those seeds and you've done the correct process of saving those seeds, they will be true to type. And so you'll get the same variety out of the seed the next season. Whereas for hybrids, you're not necessarily going to get a true to type seed, and it will be unstable. So saving seeds from hybrid, not the best idea. Now, hybridization is a natural process. It's not affiliated with GMO practices. It's not something that wouldn't naturally happen outside anyway. So essentially, it's just two different varieties breeding together. And the way I like to explain it to people is it's kind of like dogs. So for heirloom or heritage seeds, it's like people having bred dogs for many, many, many years, and they're picking the trait that they want. And so eventually we get golden retrievers or we get boxers. And that's a result of intentional breeding, but nothing unnatural has actually happened there. And then for hybrids, essentially they are two different breeds having bred together. And so why would people do that? Oftentimes it's because there's one trait that's great in one variety and another trait that's great in another variety, and they want to get the best of both into one variety. So it can be very beneficial to plant hybrid seeds. Just again, keep in mind, if you're going to save the seeds though, you're not going to want to rely on hybrid plants to save seeds from. And sorry, this title actually says genetically modified organisms. So GMOs. So what are GMOs? Let's clear up some things about it. So GMO seeds are actually not commonly sold in commercial stores. They're actually quite expensive for farmers to purchase because it is a scientifically and genetically altered crop. Usually large farms will be buying this in bulk. You're not really buying these in individual packets at the stores. One thing to know is there's actually just a handful of GMO crops that have been approved by Canada. There's corn, canola, soybeans, and sugar beets, cotton, papaya, squash, and feed alfalfa. I'm not going to get too much into the politics of GMOs. It's just to give you an idea of the scale at which GMOs are used and where they're most commonly found. So if you're buying individual packets of seeds from, just your local nursery or greenhouse or stores, you're likely not buying GMO seeds. Now, in terms of organic or not organic seeds, if you're buying organic seeds, they will certainly not be GMO. But organic seeds can be heirloom, heritage, or hybrid. And essentially, an organic seed isn't treated with any pesticides or have any chemical coatings. All right, so you've planted your seeds and they've germinated for you. What do we do now? So first thing is, if you've placed a few seeds in one cell and you're seeing that the cell has more than one seedling come up, you might need to do some thinning. This is my least favorite thing to do because I want every single seedling to grow and thrive and be happy and be planted outdoors. But it is a necessary step. If you leave all the seedlings that germinated in the cell, you're going to have a weak seedling that you're putting outside because they're sharing the nutrients in there. They are taking up space from each other. So some thinning might need to be done. Essentially what you're doing is you're pulling out or snipping away or sort of pinching off the extra seedlings so that you're left with one in the same pot or container. Sometimes if I see two, I might leave it. But certainly if you see more than that, just do a little bit of thinning. It's just part of the process. In terms of fertilizing, so seeds themselves don't need fertilizer or nutrients yet. And another reason we might use seed starting mix is that it doesn't usually have fertilizer in it. Fertilizers can actually damage some seeds if there's too much of it in the medium. So fertilizing can be started when seedlings grow 2 sets of their true leaves. So in this diagram here, you can see the very first set of leaves that a seedling will usually grow are what we call the cotyledon. Usually they'll wither away and die off once true leaves set in. So the true leaves actually take the shape of what the leaves of the plant will eventually look like. So when you get 2 sets of those true leaves, that's a pretty good time to fertilize a little bit. And often this is when we take the seedlings out of the small little container it started out in and plant it into or upplant it into a larger pot with actual potting soil and some fertilizer. So you've gotten this far, you've gotten your seedling to a point where it's ready to be transplanted outside, and you've checked your frost-free dates and your seed planting schedule to make sure that it's safe to place outside. So what you're going to do is you're going to want to harden it off. You don't want to just throw your seedlings out there and let them fend for themselves without giving them a little bit of a transition time. So what you're going to do is prior to actually fully transplanting them outside, set the seedlings out in their trays and their pots for progressively longer periods of time over 1 to 2 weeks. And just kind of keep progressively getting them used to the weather outside, the wind outside, and also being under some direct sun, which is different from what it would get through a window. And then you can actually transplant it. So just do a little bit of planning ahead of time based on your frost-free date and when you want to actually plant it outside. So let's go over some common problems. One big thing that happens to seedlings especially is damping off. What it looks like is the stem starts to rot. It's sort of weak at the bottom of the stem, and then it starts to just fall right over, just like this photo right here. And what it is it's just a soil-borne fungal disease. And it can be caused by if you went outside and you grabbed some garden soil and you just brought it in and planted in that, the fungal disease might have been brought in through that. It can also be caused by overwatering and sort of like having waterlogged soil that the seedling is constantly sitting in. Or really cool conditions. And so how do we prevent that? You can run a fan. Just make sure that you're not drying out the soil too quickly. You can try watering from below. Usually I like to do that once the seeds have germinated and some roots have been established so that they can actually reach the water from below. Certainly using a seed starting mix that's sterile, as opposed to potting soil or garden soil is very beneficial in prevention. And then just don't overwater. Eventually you might start to see some discolored leaves. And usually when it's a coloration problem, it means it's a nutrient deficiency. So there's lots of guides online that you can look into about if my plant leaves are turning yellow, if they're turning kind of purple, if it's the outside margins. There's lots of information out there for you to look at. But certainly for prevention, you can just fertilize at the right times. And eventually the plants will bounce back. You generally don't see quick plant death if it is simply a nutrient deficiency issue. We've talked about this before. So if you're starting to see on this right side, the plant is stretching out, it's very pale. The stem length between the sets of leaves or nodes is very, very long, and it just looks pretty sad. It's got a yellowish, pale, whitish color to it. What's happening is it's just not getting enough sunlight. So it's stretching out and trying to reach that sun. And this is both about the intensity of sunlight and also the duration of sunlight. So some ways you can combat this is maybe use some grow lights or have some lamps close by. Again, they're not going to necessarily die immediately if it's not getting enough sunlight. It just means that the health of the plant will suffer. So this brings us to the end of the presentation, and there are lots of amazing resources out there. I've just listed here the ones that I've actually referenced in this video, but again, lots of great information out there that you can access. So some of the ones that I recommend here are OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, has an incredible amount of information on their website. So worth looking into. If you're interested in the conversation around GMOs, the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, CBAN, has lots of great information. So worth looking into if you want to know more in depth about it. I promise we're not being paid by Johnny's, but Johnny's Seeds actually does have a lot of great tools and calculators and resources on their website. So that's another great resource. But again, there are so many fantastic resources out there for you to find. So it just takes a little bit of research, but I wish you the best of luck with starting your own seeds and reducing your carbon footprint and the amount of plastic that's being used, and just having fun and finding the joy in seeing something start from seed, turning into seedling, eventually maybe producing some food or some flowers, or even just existing out there. It's one of the best feelings to see from beginning to end. So I wish you best of luck, and I hope you find a lot of joy in this process. Thank you so much.